if you want to make her bigger, all you have to do is take your mouse and hover over her screen, and you'll see 3 little dots in the upper right corner, and you can click on those dots and click the pin button, and it'll make her image larger and everybody else's image smaller. So you can do that if you'd like to. I've muted everyone, so if you have a question, you can type it in the chat and I can ask it for you, or you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question when we get to questions. Just make sure that you mute yourself back when you're all done. And then like I said, I will be monitoring the chat. So if you have a question during the middle, feel free to type it out and I can interject that question. And then last but not least, I will be recording this. So if anybody wants to see it later, or if you mention it in class tomorrow to one of your classmates and they just think it's great and want to see a recording, I will be emailing it out to all of the teachers afterwards. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Pfeiffer, and I thank you for being with us today.
Oh, thank you, Jody. Now, Jody, you're going to be telling me if you can hear me and if I'm loud enough and all that kind of thing. Good. All right. It's such a pleasure to be here. And from what I understand of your group, you're a group of young people who are at least nominally interested in the sciences and are thinking about what direction your own lives are going to take. So I think I have 3 goals today. One is to tell you a little bit about how I got into the rather unusual kind of science that I do. Another is to convince you that bone is the most interesting material you could imagine. It's just fascinating. And the third is to tell you a little bit about how you can take a career in science and turn it into a lot of travel to challenging places and learn a lot about past people. I guess that was 4 things. Anyway, as you can tell from my gray hair, I'm well into my career. And so my own history of how I developed a career is unique to my time and place. I grew up in a very rural area, and I went to a 1-room school for the first 9 years of my life. Honest to goodness, I walked 2 miles to school, walked 2 miles home. Sometimes I got a ride. And there were 10 other children in my school, and we were lucky if we could keep a teacher for a few months before the teacher would throw up their hands and say, I can't deal with the isolation. So then I went to a high school with 150 students in it. And the point of all this is there was very little science available. Really, science was just not a thing. There was a science teacher in my high school, and it was quite, in those olden days, there was the science teacher and there was the English teacher, and they were the established teachers in the school, and they would decide when they saw a girl student, they would say, is she more of a nurse or is she more of a teacher? And unfortunately for me, Miss Schaefersman, the science teacher, decided I would make a terrible nurse and that I would have to be a teacher, so I would go to the English side. Anyway, I didn't get much science, that's what I'm telling you. And so I went to university because that's a very good way to get out of a small town. And gradually, I found my niche. I found the kinds of things that made me excited. And it wasn't really until rather late in my university years that I realized that I loved biology. I loved chemistry. These were the ways in which my brain worked. So for my master's degree, I moved somewhat into sciences. For my PhD, I moved more deeply into sciences. And then I got a job as a professor in a biology department. And the interesting thing about these kinds of careers is you just keep learning. You never stop. So you never say, here's the point where I'm done learning. Even now, I continue to learn about new things all the time. And that's it's such a joy. So you don't have to decide all at once what you're going to do, but I'm hopeful that for every one of you, you've got at least little doors opening into worlds that you can think about, because there are an awfully lot of options to be considered as long as people help you through the doors. So that's my little preamble about my own career. You may notice this thing in the background. Okay, so it's very heavy actually. So as you can see, this is a kind of a carved thing. It's got one face on the back. It's got another face on the front. It's a carving that was done actually by an Eskimo many years ago. And the reason it's sitting here is because what it's made of. This is actually made of bone. Bone is, this is the sort of porous bone that you'd find in a very, very big animal. This is a piece of whale bone, and it's been deteriorating over the years. It's gradually breaking down, and eventually, especially if I were to put it outdoors, it would fall apart, because bone will eventually fall apart unless there are special circumstances under which it fossilizes. So bone tissue is biological material, part of which is mineral and part of which isn't. This one is left with just the mineral at the moment, but that mineral is not permanent, and natural processes will make it fall apart. Like it falls apart all over my hands. Most of the time, when we're searching for the physical remains of past people, the bone is at least that fallen apart, sometimes much more fallen apart. Fossils are extremely rare, and they take thousands and thousands of years to form. So in my work, trying to reconstruct the lives of past people, I work with bone, not with fossils. And much of the bone is in very poor condition. It being in poor condition, I have to know even more about the structure of the human skeleton, because I'm working with tiny fragments. So with that as a preamble, I'm going to share my screen and show you some slides. Okay. Let's go here. Share. Okay. I think that these slides will take about 15 minutes, and then we can move to a question session. So here's a picture of me and one of my former students, who now is a professor at a university. And she's my helpful assistant, wonderfully helpful assistant, actually. As you can see, I am sitting in a hole. This is an archaeological site in along the shore of a lake in northern Kenya in East Africa. And it's along the Lake Turkana on the west side. And I'm working my way carefully through this pile of rocks that people purposely put there on top of the skeletons of members of their group who'd passed away. It's a very unusual way of showing respect for the deceased. And at this point, I'm about a meter down from the surface, and we have to go quite a bit further before we start to actually encounter the skeletons. Okay, so this is where we're working. On my left is a photograph of the landscape. You can see it's extremely dry. It doesn't matter what time of the year it is, it's always extremely dry. The map, I now, at this moment, I regret that there's not a complete map of Africa, but if you look at the part that I'm circling up here in the left-hand corner of, upper left-hand corner of the map, the country of Kenya has a black rectangle over it. That's where Lake Turkana is. The country of Kenya lies along the east coast of the continent of Africa. Its neighbor to the north is Ethiopia. So Lake Turkana is just to the south of the Ethiopian border. It used to be much, much bigger than it is now. The little dots that you see identified that look like they're quite far from the lake were right on the lake shore 5,000 years ago when people lived there. So people lived around Lake Turkana 5,000 years ago. The weather was much less dry. It was a more easy to live in environment. And you can see by the dots that people lived all around the lake, hundreds and hundreds of miles. It's a big enough lake that you cannot see from one side to the other. I wish that I can't think of how to describe the size of the lake. It's several hundred miles from the north end to the south end of the lake. So I'm going to be talking about sites that are along the west side of Lake Turkana, the sites that are circled on this map. So the people lived there about 4,800 years ago. All of our radiocarbon dates, and we now have at least 12 dates, are in a tight little window of time. It's so intriguing that people appear to have been quite numerous during a brief period of time, about 4,800 years ago. And for some reason, they decided to form funeral sites or cemeteries by placing their bodies of the deceased into a deep pit and then covering that pit with these rounded basalt pebbles. And then on the very top, they put large columns of basalt that we call pillars, like this. The combination of the heat, the intermittent moisture, and all those rocks pressing down on top of the skeletons led to very, very poor bone preservation. So let's say some archaeologists decide that this would be an interesting culture to explore. Why do you bother to bring along somebody who's a specialist in human skeletons? Well, you do it because during the excavation, you want to know who was buried there. One of the questions about who is buried there is, were they men or women? Were they babies? Were they children? Were they adults? And this is just a simple example of the sort of data that we would collect as we do the excavations. How many skeletons do we find that of people who died between when they were born and 2 years old? How many were under 30 years of age, women and men? Over 30 years of age, women, men, and we don't know? Or can we just say that they were adult because we can't be any more specific? So that's one kind of information that we try to collect as we do the excavations. Another way that we need to try to understand the intent of the people who did the burying is to look at the position of the body. You may know that some cultures are very intent on always making sure that the head of the deceased is toward the sunrise or the sunset. we were interested too to try to understand how these bodies were positioned. So these very colorful circle diagrams illustrate that they were positioned in all sorts of ways, sometimes with only their legs flexed, sometimes with their arms and their legs flexed, sometimes they appeared to be seated, sometimes on their backs, sometimes on their stomachs, right side, left side. What these diagrams show is that the burials that we found come in lots of different positions, and there are lots of different ages and sexes. So were they facing north? Were they facing south, east, west, up, down? They were oriented in many, many different ways. And those sorts of pieces of information only come from being able to identify the fragments of bone and understand the position of the body. So generally within these pillar sites, the bodies were flexed with tight flexion of the legs and often flexion of the arms as well. They hardly ever were buried with any gifts, any grave goods, but they very, very frequently were wearing jewelry. Beads at the neck were the most common, but they also wore bangles and earrings and ankle beads and torso adornments, some really amazing outfits. So here's some examples from the field. And I hope that you can see my cursor as I move it around. Here, for example, now, little tiny white things down here, those are teeth. So you know that you're in the area of a skull, but you have to be able to identify tiny fragments of skull bone to see how is the head lying? Is it on its side? Is it face up? This is an earring that is made of a turquoise stone. Moving over to the center of the top of this picture, here's an amazing little amulet that had a hole through it so that you could string it on a string, and probably a very attractive necklace made out of these turquoise stones, sitting next to skull bones. So this is a turquoise necklace that was around somebody's neck. Moving along on the top, here are some very, very white beads that were at somebody's neck, but then through being jostled around, ended up between their teeth, actually. These are the upper teeth of a jaw, and these are the lower teeth of a jaw. So I guess in a way, this is sort of an upside down picture. But the point is that it's all quite a jumble. The lower level here, we've got more examples of the sorts of interesting beads that were made out of stones that would have been attractive to the eye. Down here in this corner is a piece of carnelian, which is bright red and a very attractive stone. And here in the middle are some, you can read the label, it says OES beads. That stands for ostrich eggshell. It was very, very popular to take the eggshell of the ostrich, which is thicker than a chicken egg shell, and drill pieces of eggshell and then string those drilled beads on a string. And these ostrich eggshell beads are displayed with an upper arm, a humerus, and a clavicle or collarbone of a child who was probably between ages 2 and 3. Here's some more, there we go. Some more examples of the sorts of finery that people were buried with. In the upper left-hand corner, there's someone who was buried with a huge number of rather large, why does that keep happening? There we go. Large, heavy stone beads around her pelvis. It was like an apron there were about 4 times as many as are shown in this slide. A large number of heavy stone beads, not the kind of thing that you'd want to be walking around with, but rather something that they decided she needed to be buried wearing. And also the same person who had the heavy stone bead pelvic apron also had a number of beads made out of animal teeth where the root of the tooth had been drilled so that the animal tooth could be worn on a string. And some of the animal teeth, like this one, came from lions. And there are other areas where the rows of ostrich eggshell beads were in pairs. And this is the only archaeological site I've worked on where my sewing kit came in handy. We had so many ostrich eggshell beads in some cases that we just brought needle and thread to the field, and as we took the beads out of the ground, we just put them onto string to keep them in the proper order. Another material that was common at these sites along Lake Turkana was ivory. We think of ivory as something that's very permanent and very hard, but not after you put it into African soils for thousands of years. The main picture here is of bangles made of ivory around an ulna. This is the 2 bones of the forearm. The ulna is the main bone that you see here, and hiding just behind is a little bit of the radius. So this person had 2 rather large ivory bangles around his or her forearm. I really don't remember if this was a male or a female skeleton. You can see that the ivory is falling apart. It's flaking. Now, this is a big bangle, and we can determine from its internal structure that it came from a hippo. So these are bangles made from hippo teeth, which is pretty cool. And the other 2 pictures are of other plackets of ivory that probably had an interesting structure when they were made, but by the time we found them, they were nothing but very, very white, flaking material, deteriorating as we exposed them. Other sorts of things that we can determine from these skeletons, sometimes, very rarely, we can get some sense of cause of death. On the left-hand side is the inner side of the skull of a child, and it's much more porous than it should be, and it probably indicates some kind of inflammatory disease. And against the blue background are some teeth that are very unusual in their form, and that can potentially give us a clue to where the relatives of these people lived if we can find other skeletal collections that show the same unusual tooth form. And one of my students did manage to find that. Another thing, another use for somebody with a skeletal specialty is to work out what we call secondary burials. These 2, what you can see here is a nice complete femur, and beneath that one is another femur that we can only see the top part of, but this is the head of a humerus. So you've got basically a shoulder joint here, the humerus and the scapula, and this shoulder joint is lying immediately beneath a thigh. And then there's a rib here, and this is a part of a hip bone, which is further down. This is an ankle, which is right next to a hip. The point is that sometimes just the bones are buried long after the soft tissue is gone, so that the bones are no longer in anatomical position. in this case, there was a bundle burial that included at least partial skeletons from 5 people. So it takes knowledge of the bones of the body and the way they look at different ages in order to make sense of all that. So I think that this slide is here to remind me that excavations like the one I was just talking about are very challenging to pull off. And they need the sustained attention of people like the archaeologists on this team, Elizabeth Hildebrand and Catherine Grillo. And you need support from the Kenyan National Council of Science and Technology to get your permits. And you need funding from places like the National Science Foundation and the National Geographic Society. So those are some pictures that I hope can help get us going on some discussion. How's that, Jody? All right. Let's see. I'm going to open the chat so I can see. Nope, no questions in the chat. Would anybody like to talk about anything? This is the joy of Zoom.
Right. Does
How many
anyone have
sites?
questions?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so one of our students wants to know, Dr. Pfeiffer, how many sites have you been to? This is, I know, just one of the many, and so we're interested in that.
Okay, I'd be happy to talk about that. That's a good question, and I really wish that I would have started to keep better notes back in the beginning. Okay, how do I approach that? Most of my research has been done not digging people up, but rather studying the skeletons that are already in museums. So I've probably excavated on about 25 or 30 sites, but I've spent at least as much time, probably more, in different museums around the world, trying to understand past lifeways from studying skeletal collections in museums. Right now, I'm working on a book, and half of it is about the work that I've done to try to reconstruct the lives of past North American Aboriginal people, indigenous people. And the other half is about what I've tried to understand about African people. So my main areas of interest have been North America, especially right around the Great Lakes, around Toronto, where I live, and Southern Africa. Well, Southern Africa, let's just say Africa, because I've worked in both South Africa and East Africa. I can tell you, I can make a long list of all the things I haven't done. I've never worked on the prehistory of Europe. I don't know anything about Neanderthals to speak of. Well, I have to lecture about these things, but I have no direct evidence. I think I've held real Neanderthal bones in my hands maybe twice. I don't know anything about Australia. There's major blocks of the world where I've never been, but have quite a bit of experience in around the Great Lakes of North America and in Africa. That's a long answer.
We have a couple more questions in the chat.
Yes.
What is your favorite bone part that you've ever found?
Oh, well, I've often said that my favorite bone is the humerus, because how can you not love something called a humerus?
Mhm.
It's just got such a great name, and there's all kinds of interesting things you can learn. The humerus is the upper arm bone. And from an upper arm bone, you can learn so much about people. Like if let's say you're a person who has a physically challenging job. Well, if you are either right-handed or left-handed, your right humerus or your left humerus will be bigger than the other one. Or even if you're just an extremely dedicated tennis player, it will make one of your upper arms more powerfully built than the other. And the muscle attachment sites on the humerus can tell you things about what you were doing with your rotator cuff. And there's just a lot of exciting things you can learn from a humerus. So that's my favorite bone. But I don't think that's exactly what you asked me, was it?
Your favorite. Yeah.
I think that in terms of discoveries, the thing that can bring the greatest satisfaction is when you're able to understand what might have cut someone's life short. Mostly, we can't tell from a skeleton what the cause of death was. And most skeletons are from adults who probably lived long, hopefully happy lives, and then died of some natural cause. But when you find the skeleton of a child, children aren't supposed to die, and they don't die very often. So the skeleton of a child is a rare thing. And if you can ascertain what caused them to die, it can be very satisfying. I also sometimes have had the opportunity to see skeletons of people who had serious disabilities and yet managed to deal with that disability for many, many years. And that too, you feel as though you're able to tell a story that otherwise just wouldn't be told, because these are all people who lived before there were written records. Nobody was writing down the story of their lives. Nobody was writing down or taking pictures or doing videos of what they ate for dinner. They are invisible to our world unless somebody goes in and tries to tell their story.
We have a few more questions.
Great.
How did you become involved in these types of activities? What led you to where you're at?
Right. Good fortune in part, good luck. Oh golly, I'm trying to think of a way to tell it briefly,
Right.
Okay, so I already told you I'm from a very rural background. I decided that what I wanted to do with my life was to teach something that would create world peace. And I decided when I was a teenager that the problem was religion, that I needed to teach about world religions, because then if everybody understood each other's religion, there would be world peace. So I did a bachelor's degree in religion. And then I didn't know what to do, and I became a cleaning lady. So being a cleaning lady is very hard work, and I discovered that I had high marks, so I could go to graduate school instead. I could make as much money in graduate school as I could as a cleaning lady, and it was easier. So by that point, I was married and I was living in a town where my husband was a student, and so I had limited options, and anthropology was one of the departments that I thought I could get into. So this is maybe more detail than you wanted. But in that anthropology department, I took a course on human evolution. And that was just perfect. Because not only did it allow me to study things that fascinated me, but I realized that teaching about human evolution would also lead to world peace. So I shifted my orientation. And then my husband got a job and we moved. And so then I went to the anthropology department in the new town and I said, I'm excited, I'm keen, I want to do this. And they said, well, here's a job on an archaeological site. We're excavating skeletons. And that's the short version.
Nice.
So unfortunately, I have not yet achieved world peace, but you know, there is, it's funny how life evolves.
It does.
Yes.
All right, we have a couple questions centered around preservation.
Yes.
So how have you ever found a skeleton intact?
Oh,
And then
yes.
how do bones stay preserved?
Yes. Okay. If bone is very well preserved, if it is not exposed to moisture, heat, and bugs. Bone is pretty much half and half mineral and soft tissue, collagen and water. So once a body is placed in the ground, if that's organic soil, there are all kinds of microbes that go after the organic part of the bone. And then once the organic part of the bone is gone, the mineral component falls apart, like those pictures that I showed you. So a very, very dry cave or very dried sands or the Arctic, things like all these discoveries about ancient DNA come most easily from bone that has been frozen. Being frozen is the best because no bugs are there to eat it. There's no moisture to freeze and thaw, to break it up. And yeah, that's good. So yeah, did that answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. That was a great
All
answer.
right.
Couple more questions. Where have you discovered the most bones at?
Well, the most bones in one place come from sites where people purposely compile skeletons in what we call secondary burials. And so for me, I have excavated sites where the remains of about 500 people are all commingled in a single pit. There are some indigenous people of North America who followed a very interesting practice. I'll try to describe it quickly. When someone would die, they would set the body aside and they would grieve, but they would not say their final goodbyes. And then about once every 10 years, the community would come together, dig a big, big pit, and then the remains of everyone who had died previously, since the last time they did a feast of the dead, would be brought to this pit and everybody's skeletons would be put in together so that all of the members of the community could go on their journey to the afterlife together, so that the community stayed together as a piece. They needed to be together and there'd be a 2 or 3 day ceremony, a big, big, big funeral to say their final goodbyes. And then that would be the end for those souls. Those souls would move on to the afterlife. So these big collections of bones are called ossuaries. And they're very challenging, but you can learn a lot about people, even from these big commingled burials. And I'm happy to say that in the Toronto region, we made an arrangement with the descendants of those people and we work together with them to study their ancestors and to tell stories about the ancestors. We have reburied the bones, but the descendants let us keep one tooth from each skeleton. And we can use the teeth to do chemistry and DNA, and we can learn a lot from the teeth.
That kind of leads right into the next question. The next question was, how do you receive permission to kind of do what you do and where in the areas that you're doing them in?
Right. Thank you for asking that, because it's really important. And it's a way that things have changed a lot since I started my career. We now will the heritage of a place is usually under the jurisdiction of the state, or in Canada, the province. And so there are always laws about who can dig and who has to give permission before that dig can happen. So all of that has developed over the last few decades, but now there's another layer, another very important layer, which is that you need to be mindful of the descendants. And you need also to interact with the descendants to get permission and engagement from them. So you actually need to make a plan to some extent before you do the dig. It gets difficult because, of course, you don't know what you're going to find until you find it. Much of the kind of work that I do in North America happens by accident, where they're widening a road and they bump into burials that they didn't know were there. In Africa, it's a little bit different because the African story is so much deeper. It's people have been in Africa for literally millions of years. So just because you're digging a site along the shore of Lake Turkana doesn't mean that the people that you're studying are at all related to the people who live there now. And in the case of Lake Turkana, the people who live there now, who are a tribe known as the Turkana, don't think that the people we're excavating belong to them at all. They see them as a completely different group. And they work with us. They seem fine with it. Or they are fine with it. I shouldn't say seem. But we do work hard to make sure that they're a part of the team. And I'm sorry to say that I don't know how to speak Swahili, but most of the rest of the team does know how to speak Swahili, so they're able to communicate better with them. Does that answer that question?
Yes, yeah, that was great.
Okay.
Let's see. 2 more questions came in. Was there a site that you went to that you found something really surprising or something that you didn't expect?
Well, I think that those Turkana sites were about as surprising as they get. Nobody even knew there were burials down there. It was just a guess that these pillar sites with all of these rocks that had been brought in from afar must have something special down below, and maybe it was skeletons. So yeah, I think the slides that I showed you give some sense of what I thought was one of the most novel, one of the most surprising sites. Yeah.
And then how do these excavations turn into interpretations or understanding of ancient people?
Right, right. For every day that you spend digging, you probably spend a year working on first interpreting what you dug, and second, making sense of it into a broader context. So it's very important to document and to archive everything that gets excavated, hugely important. All the photographs need to be labeled so that you've got a documentary record that can be shared with others. But then you need also to do lab tests for things like their stable isotopes to reconstruct their diet, or some other stable isotopes that tell you whether they were born where they died or whether they've moved across the landscape during their lives. Radiocarbon dating has to be done. So you spend a year or more collecting these pieces of information related to what you dug. And then you work with your team to read what other people have been doing or talk with them at conferences about what they're doing. And then you make a picture as best you can. You write it down. You submit it to a journal. It gets reviewed. And you go through a kind of academic process of contributing to the knowledge base. It's that creation of new knowledge that is so exciting. Like in a site that I worked on in South Africa, I studied the remains of a small number of skeletons that had been found together. And then later, researchers from Europe were able to extract ancient DNA from those skeletons. And the skeleton that provided the best ancient DNA, the most complete, was from an 8-year-old boy who had died prematurely. And I had already studied that skeleton and seen that there were signs of disease. And so we went back to that skeleton and we determined that the boy had probably died of a parasitic disease that's common to that region. And we were able to expand on the storyline. The geneticists had told one part of his story, but we could tell a different part of his story, so that it wasn't just this child represents a particular gene pool, but also this child had a life that included probably malnutrition and a stomach problem. And we were able to give some symptomology to the last parts of his life to make it more, I don't know, more complete, to give him more of a human face. And that kind of thing takes time.
Absolutely. Someone asks, what's the most valuable thing you've ever discovered?
Oh, all right. First of all, not much. This is not ancient Egypt. No fancy stuff. Of course, I think that a perforated lion's tooth is pretty neat, but it probably doesn't, have much commercial value. I remember when I was a graduate student, I would often be asked to join excavations because I was always enthusiastic and I came really cheap. And we were excavating around, there was a building that had to be moved and there was a cemetery that was being disturbed. And so the question was, were we going to be disturbing any of the bones? So I was there to monitor. And sure enough, we did disturb a skeleton and that person had a gold tooth. And that's it. I don't excavate valuable things.
Okay. Last question in here is, this one's a long one. Are you able to determine social status or importance of a person based on a person's burial?
That's an interesting question, because right now, in the context of that Lake Turkana project, my coworkers and I are debating whether we can do that. Personally, I think that a particular skeleton that we excavated had to have been high status because of a number of variables. And my coworkers are saying, now, wait a minute, let's not go beyond what the data show us. And so we're having this pleasant back and forth about how we can interpret I'll tell you about this person. I'm almost certain it's a female, even though the bone is in such poor condition that the usual indicators from the pelvis and the skull are not as well, they just, much of it had fallen apart. So I'm basing the assumption of female sex on less evidence than usual. But I can say that this was a young adult who was very tall and was very delicately built. And this person's face was asymmetrical, a very asymmetrical face. So this person would have looked very unusual in life. And the pattern of facial asymmetry plus some characteristics of the back of the skull make me think that the person suffered from torticollis, which is a when the neck gets twisted during birth, it can lead to some permanent damage to the head and neck. So this is a somewhat disadvantaged person, and yet they were buried with thousands and thousands and thousands of beads and bracelets made out of hyena teeth. Now, I think this has got to be a special person. But my colleagues point out that we know so little about this society, so little about their culture, that we can't extrapolate. We can just provide the data and then wait to see what happens as we accumulate more information.
That's a great answer. Well, Dr. Pfeiffer, I really appreciate you coming in with us and sharing your knowledge and pictures with us. It's been really great. I know we had some wonderful questions from our students, so they appreciate it too.
Just terrific. I can see that I haven't read everything in the chat, but I see there's lots of questions there, and I appreciate your engagement. Of course, it's great fun to talk about what you love, and so it was a great privilege for me. Good luck, everybody.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you all for coming.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Yay.